In the dusty corridors of Egypt's Valley of the Kings lies one of history's most chilling mysteries, a tale that has captivated the world for over a century and continues to perplex experts today. The boy King Tutankhamun, who ruled ancient Egypt over 3,000 years ago, met his end in circumstances so disturbing that they've spawned countless theories, terrifying curses, and scientific investigations that reveal a truth more shocking than any Hollywood thriller. When British archaeologist Howard Carter peered through that tiny breach in the tomb's doorway on November 26, 1922, his famous words, "Yes, wonderful things," would echo through history. But behind the glittering treasures and golden mask lay a darker story, one of physical torment, genetic horror, and a death so brutal that modern science is still piecing together the horrifying details. You see, King Tutankhamun wasn't the mighty pharaoh of popular imagination. Recent DNA analysis and virtual autopsies have revealed a shocking truth that would make any horror writer jealous. This wasn't a powerful ruler who died peacefully in his sleep. This was a frail, deformed young man whose very existence was a testament to the devastating consequences of royal inbreeding, and whose death was so traumatic that his mummified remains literally caught fire inside his own coffin. Before we dive into the haunting circumstances of his death, we need to understand just how cursed this boy's life truly was from the moment of his birth. The genetic nightmare that was Tutankhamun's family tree reads like something from a medical textbook on everything that can go wrong when siblings reproduce. DNA testing conducted in 2010 delivered results that shocked even seasoned Egyptologists. Tutankhamun's parents weren't just related. They were full siblings, both children of the pharaoh Amenhotep III and his chief wife Tai. His father was most likely Akhenaten, the heretical pharaoh who had turned Egypt's religious world upside down by abandoning the traditional gods in favor of worshipping only the sun disk Aten. Marriage within the royal family wasn't uncommon in ancient Egypt. The pharaohs believed they were descended from gods, and incest was seen as acceptable, even necessary, to retain the sacred bloodline. But they were completely unaware of the severe genetic consequences that would follow. What they got was a genetic disaster that would plague the young king throughout his brief life. The boy who would become Tutankhamun was born with a horrifying collection of genetic defects. He suffered from a cleft palate that would have made eating and speaking difficult. His left foot was severely deformed, a condition known as club foot that left him unable to walk properly. He had feminine hips, an unusual body shape for a male pharaoh who was supposed to embody masculine power and strength. His bite was so severely misaligned that his teeth didn't meet properly, another painful reminder of his genetic curse. But perhaps most devastating of all was a rare bone disorder called Köhler disease, which restricted blood flow to the bones in his feet. This caused necrosis, literally the death of bone tissue, making every step an agony. The discovery of 130 walking canes in his tomb tells us everything we need to know about his mobility. This wasn't a pharaoh who rode chariots into glorious battle. This was a young man who couldn't even walk without support. Geneticist Karsten Pusch, who worked on the DNA analysis, painted a heartbreaking picture of the boy king's reality. He was not a very strong pharaoh. He was not riding the chariots. The researcher went on to explain that Tutankhamun's family were suffering. The walking canes found in his tomb weren't ceremonial objects, they were medical necessities, worn smooth from constant use. Some showed clear signs of wear on the handles where his hands had gripped them day after day. Even more telling, several of the canes were the right height for a teenager, adjusted as he grew from child to young adult, each one a testament to years of struggle and pain. But the genetic horrors were just the beginning. As if his physical deformities weren't enough, Tutankhamun was also battling a deadly enemy that would ultimately contribute to his demise: malaria. DNA analysis revealed traces of the most virulent strain of the malaria parasite in his mummified remains, evidence that he had been repeatedly infected with this mosquito-borne killer. In the ancient world, malaria was often fatal. Without modern medicine, The recurring fevers, chills, and weakness would have been devastating for someone already weakened by genetic disorders. The combination of bone necrosis and malarial infection created a perfect storm of medical catastrophe. His tomb contained what archaeologists have dubbed an afterlife pharmacy, an extensive collection of medical supplies and remedies that spoke to his constant battle against illness and pain. The young pharaoh who ascended to the throne at just 8 or 9 years old was guided by powerful advisors, including the Grand Vizier and Horemheb, the military commander. But even with the best care available in the ancient world, his body was failing him. Every day was a struggle against pain, weakness, and recurring illness. Yet somehow, this broken young man managed to rule Egypt for nearly a decade. Born as Tutankhamun during his father's religious revolution, he later changed his name to Tutankhamun as part of his restoration of traditional Egyptian religion. He moved the royal court from his father's experimental capital at Amarna back to Memphis, undoing the chaos of the Aten period and restoring the worship of the traditional gods. His reign, though brief and overshadowed by his famous tomb discovery, was actually considered one of the greatest restoration periods in ancient Egyptian history. But his body couldn't keep pace with his royal duties. The combination of genetic defects, bone disease, and recurring malaria was slowly killing him. As Tutankhamun approached his 18th year, his condition was deteriorating rapidly. The necrosis in his left foot was spreading, making walking even more painful and difficult. The malaria attacks were becoming more frequent and severe. His advisors must have known that time was running out for their young pharaoh, but what actually killed him remains one of archaeology's most debated mysteries. Was it the malaria finally overwhelming his weakened immune system? Was it complications from his bone disease? Or was something far more violent and sudden responsible for ending his tortured existence? The first clues came from X-rays taken in 1968, which revealed puzzling bone fragments floating inside Tutankhamun's skull. Initially, experts interpreted this as evidence that the young pharaoh had been struck on the head, perhaps by political rivals in a palace assassination. The theory fit perfectly with the narrative of political upheaval that characterized the end of the 18th dynasty after his father's controversial reign. But as technology advanced and more sophisticated scanning techniques became available, a far more disturbing picture began to emerge. CT scans revealed a pattern of injuries so shocking that they suggested something far more violent than a simple blow to the head or death from disease. The virtual autopsy revealed devastating trauma down the entire left side of Tutankhamun's body. His ribs were shattered. His pelvis was fractured in multiple places. His left thigh bone had suffered a severe compound fracture shortly before death, with no signs of healing, indicating this was not an old injury, but something that happened in his final moments. Most disturbing of all, his heart was completely missing from his mummified remains. In Egyptian mummification, the heart was always left in the body because it was believed to be needed in the afterlife for the weighing of the soul. The fact that Tutankhamun's heart was absent suggests it was so badly damaged that the embalmers couldn't preserve it. The pattern of injuries painted a horrific picture. This wasn't death from illness or a simple assassination. This was massive trauma, consistent with being struck by something large, fast, and devastating. The evidence pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Tutankhamun had been killed in a high-speed chariot accident. The circumstantial evidence supported this theory. Several chariots were entombed with Tutankhamun, and despite his physical limitations, stone reliefs depicted him riding chariots, probably during ceremonial hunts. His passion for hunting, despite his disabilities, may have led to his doom. Picture the scene. The young pharaoh, desperate to prove himself despite his physical limitations, participating in a royal hunt, perhaps driving his own chariot or standing in one driven by another, when something went catastrophically wrong. Maybe the horses spooked, maybe a wheel broke, or maybe his weakened condition caused him to lose control. The impact would have been devastating. Struck by the full weight of a high-speed chariot, his frail body couldn't withstand the trauma. The crushing force shattered his ribs, fractured his pelvis, and broke his leg in a compound fracture that would have been fatal in a world without antibiotics or modern surgery. But here's where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. The young pharaoh may not have died immediately. The compound fracture of his thigh bone could have led to a life-threatening infection when combined with his existing malaria. He may have lingered for hours or even days, his broken body finally succumbing to shock, blood loss, and infection. The embalmers who prepared his body for the afterlife were faced with an unprecedented challenge. The pharaoh's body was so badly damaged that normal mummification procedures weren't sufficient. In their attempts to preserve the broken remains, they made a fatal error that would haunt Tutankhamun even in death. They used excessive amounts of embalming oils and resins, far more than was typical for royal mummies. These oils, combined with the linen wrappings and sealed environment of the nested coffins, created a chemical reaction that would shock researchers over 3,000 years later. Dr. Chris Naunton, who studied the mummy extensively, made a startling discovery. The embalming oils had combined with oxygen and linen to create a chemical reaction that literally cooked the king's body at temperatures exceeding 200 degrees Celsius. The charring and possibility that a botched mummification led the body spontaneously combusting shortly after burial was entirely unexpected, something of a revelation. Naunton explained. Yes, you heard that correctly. King Tutankhamun's mummy had caught fire inside his own coffin. The boy king, who had suffered through a life of genetic deformities, chronic pain, and recurring illness, who may have died in a horrific chariot accident, was then literally burned alive in his own tomb by the very process meant to preserve him for eternity. Chemical tests confirmed that the mummy was burnt while still sealed inside his coffin. Fire investigators demonstrated how the embalming oils led to spontaneous combustion, turning the young pharaoh's final resting place into a furnace. When researchers first attempted to extract DNA from Tutankhamun's mummy, their initial solutions turned murky black from some unidentified product of this mummification disaster. The discovery of this spontaneous combustion explained why Tutankhamun's mummy was in such poor condition compared to other royal mummies. It wasn't just the passage of time or tomb robbers. The mystery deepens as we delve into the tomb of King Tutankhamun, where what should have been eternal rest became an eternal nightmare. The discovery by Howard Carter on November 4, 1922, would not only rewrite history, but reveal a series of disturbing truths about the boy king's final moments that continue to haunt researchers today. The discovery itself was almost accidental. A young water carrier, digging absently in the sand with a stick, felt something hard beneath the surface. What he had uncovered was the first stone step of a staircase that had been hidden for over 3,000 years. Carter, realizing the magnitude of what lay before them, made the difficult decision to fill in the staircase temporarily to protect what could be the archaeological find of the century. 3 days later, they began their methodical excavation. Step by step, they descended into the past, until finally they reached a sealed doorway stamped with the cartouche of Tutankhamun. On November 26, 1922, Carter made his famous tiny breach in the top left corner of the doorway using a chisel his grandmother had given him. But wonderful things often come with a terrible price. The tomb Carter entered was unlike any other royal burial site ever discovered. While other pharaohs' tombs had been systematically looted over the millennia, Tutankhamun's remained virtually intact, containing over 400 individual items. Yet this preservation came with its own dark secrets. The tomb's layout was peculiar, cramped, and hastily arranged. Unlike the grand sprawling burial chambers of other New Kingdom pharaohs, Tutankhamun's eternal resting place consisted of just 4 small chambers. This wasn't originally meant for a king at all. Archaeological evidence suggests the tomb was initially intended for his advisor Ai, but when the 18-year-old pharaoh died unexpectedly, the burial site was hastily enlarged and repurposed. The rushed nature of his burial becomes even more apparent when examining the mummification process itself. What Carter's team discovered would challenge everything they thought they knew about ancient Egyptian embalming practices. When they finally unwrapped the mummy in 1925, they found something deeply disturbing. The body was not the perfectly preserved remains they expected, but rather a charred, blackened husk that looked more like the victim of a house fire than a carefully mummified pharaoh. British scientists would later discover that Tutankhamun's mummy had spontaneously combusted while sealed inside his coffin. Chemical tests confirmed that the embalming oils used on his body had reacted with oxygen and linen, creating a chemical reaction that literally cooked the king's body at temperatures exceeding 200 degrees Celsius. Dr. Chris Naunton described this revelation as entirely unexpected, something of a revelation that showed how the charring and botched mummification led the body to spontaneously combust shortly after burial. During the DNA extraction process decades later, scientists found their initial solutions turning murky black. It took 6 months of painstaking work to identify and remove the contamination caused by this unidentified product of the mummification process. Even in death, Tutankhamun's body continued to hold secrets that resisted modern scientific investigation. The physical evidence of his final moments tells an even more horrifying story. Virtual autopsy technology revealed a stunning pattern of injuries down one side of Tutankhamun's body. His ribs were shattered, his pelvis fractured, and most telling of all, his heart was completely missing. In ancient Egyptian belief, the heart was the most important organ, carefully preserved for the afterlife. The fact that it was absent suggests it was so badly damaged that the embalmers had no choice but to remove it entirely. CT scans showed that Tutankhamun had suffered a severe compound fracture to his left thigh bone shortly before his death. The lack of any healing around the fracture indicates this was not an old injury, but something that occurred in his final moments. The pattern of trauma, including the missing heart and the crushing injuries down the left side of his body, painted a picture of violent, sudden death. Circumstantial evidence supports the theory that young Tutankhamun died in a high-speed chariot accident. Several chariots were entombed with him, and stone reliefs depict him riding these vehicles, suggesting this was not just a royal pastime, but a genuine passion. For a physically frail young man already weakened by genetic disorders and recurring malaria, the combination of speed, unstable terrain, and his own physical limitations would have been a deadly mix. The horror of his death was compounded by his physical condition in life. Recent DNA analysis revealed that his parents were full siblings, both children of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai. This royal inbreeding, practiced to keep the bloodline pure, had devastating consequences. Tutankhamun suffered from a cleft palate, severe overbite, club foot, feminine hips, and most debilitating of all, Köhler disease, a rare bone disorder that restricted blood flow to his foot bones. The 130 walking canes found in his tomb weren't ceremonial objects, but necessary medical equipment for a young man who could barely walk without assistance. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Tutankhamun's story is how his suffering continued even after death. The botched mummification that led to his spontaneous combustion meant that while his soul was supposedly journeying to the afterlife, his physical body was literally burning alive inside his golden coffin. The boy who had lived in pain died in agony and was consumed by fire in what should have been his eternal rest. The expedition that discovered him was itself touched by tragedy. Lord Carnarvon, the financial backer of the excavation, died early in the process from an infected mosquito bite that he accidentally cut while shaving. Yet the coincidence was unsettling enough to fuel decades of speculation about supernatural retribution. The treasures found in the tomb, while magnificent, also tell the story of a life cut tragically short. Among the grave goods were items that revealed intimate details about the boy king's daily struggles. A mannequin that may have helped him choose what to wear, specially designed sandals to accommodate his deformed foot, and an afterlife pharmacy filled with medicines to treat his malarial infections. The golden funeral mask, now one of the most iconic artifacts in the world, was designed to allow his soul to recognize his face and return to his mummified body to ensure resurrection. But with his body reduced to charred remains by the chemical fire that consumed him, one wonders what his soul found when it returned to seek its earthly vessel. Howard Carter would spend the next 10 years methodically cataloging every item in the tomb, each artifact photographed in its original position before being carefully removed. His meticulous documentation created a complete record of how everything had been placed on the day the tomb was sealed, preserving not just the objects, but the moment of Tutankhamun's final journey into eternity. The tragedy of King Tutankhamun extends far beyond his individual suffering. He represents the ultimate victim of royal traditions that prioritized bloodline purity over human welfare, of religious beliefs that demanded elaborate rituals even when those rituals went catastrophically wrong, and of political necessities that forced a sickly child to rule an empire while his body slowly failed him. His story serves as a haunting reminder that behind the golden masks and magnificent treasures of ancient Egypt lay very human stories of pain, suffering, and tragic early death. The true horror of King Tutankhamun's death lies not just in his violent end, but in the disturbing web of evidence that reveals the final, desperate moments of a cursed dynasty. What happened next would shock even the most seasoned archaeologists and rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancient Egyptian burial practices. When Howard Carter finally entered the burial chamber on that fateful day in 1925, he expected to find the preserved remains of the boy king in pristine condition. Instead, what he discovered was a nightmare that defied explanation. The innermost golden coffin, worth millions in today's currency, contained something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The mummy of Tutankhamun was not the peaceful, perfectly preserved pharaoh they anticipated. Instead, it was a charred, blackened husk that crumbled at the slightest touch. Chemical analysis would later reveal the horrifying truth. The boy king's body had literally caught fire inside his sealed coffin, burning at temperatures exceeding 200 degrees Celsius in what researchers now call spontaneous combustion. Dr. Seher. The embalming oils, meant to preserve the young pharaoh for eternity, had instead created a chemical reaction that cooked his body from within. The sacred resins and perfumes, combined with the linen wrappings and oxygen trapped inside the coffin, had turned Tutankhamun's final resting place into a furnace. This wasn't simply poor mummification technique. This was a catastrophic failure that speaks to the rushed, desperate nature of his burial. Remember, this was a pharaoh who died unexpectedly at just 18 years old, likely from the combination of a devastating chariot accident and his genetic frailties. The embalmers, working under immense pressure to prepare their king for the afterlife, had made fatal errors that would haunt his remains for over 3 millennia. The implications are staggering. In ancient Egyptian belief, the preservation of the body was absolutely crucial for the soul's journey in the afterlife. Without an intact physical form, the pharaoh's K, or life force, would be lost forever. The very priests tasked with ensuring his eternal glory had inadvertently condemned him to spiritual oblivion. But the horror doesn't end there. When researchers attempted to extract DNA samples from the mummy decades later, their solutions turned murky black, contaminated by mysterious byproducts of the mummification process that took 6 months of painstaking work to identify and remove. Even in death, even after thousands of years, Tutankhamun's remains continued to resist examination, as if cursed by the botched burial that had consumed his body. The burned mummy also explains another disturbing aspect of the discovery. Carter's team found that many of the precious amulets and jewelry placed within the mummy's wrappings had been fused to the body by the intense heat. Golden daggers, sacred scarabs, and protective charms meant to guide the pharaoh through the underworld had become part of the charred remains, creating a grotesque fusion of flesh, bone, and precious metal. This catastrophic end to the boy king's physical form serves as the ultimate symbol of his cursed lineage. Born from an incestuous union between siblings, plagued by genetic disorders throughout his short life, killed in a violent accident, and finally consumed by fire in his own tomb, Tutankhamun's story reads like a tragic Greek myth come to life. The spontaneous combustion of his mummy stands as perhaps the most haunting detail in this already disturbing tale. It represents not just the failure of ancient preservation techniques, but the final, cruel twist in a life marked by suffering and misfortune. The boy who should have ruled Egypt for decades, who should have been preserved as a god-king for eternity, instead became a cautionary tale about the dangers of royal inbreeding, political instability, and the hubris of those who believed they could cheat death itself. Today, as visitors gaze upon Tutankhamun's golden death mask in museums around the world, they are looking at the beautiful face of a young man whose actual remains tell a far darker story. Behind that serene, eternal expression lies the reality of a body consumed by flames, a dynasty destroyed by its own practices, and a civilization's deepest fears about death and the afterlife made manifest in the most horrifying way possible.